I promised you an interactive panel. The time has come. Andy Revkin is going to talk to his panelists about Governance 2.0. Andy.
Great, thank you. So we have just over a half hour to go through some new ideas, given what seem to be some pretty tough blockades against top-down diplomatic governance-style solutions to environmental challenges. Just look at what's happening with elephants in Africa right now due to the unerring thirst for ivory in Asia. Look at the stasis on climate, where the only thing that seems to rein in emissions is economic breakdown, which happened recently. The United States is not going to return to its levels of emissions that it had at its peak in the mid-2000s till probably 2030 now, according to the Energy Department. But that's not good news in a sense. So how do we break forward? And we have a great panel here. We're going to keep the introductions brief and brisk, and so that we can get to the discussion with everybody via Twitter and the hashtag AskPlanet, #AskPlanet on Twitter, and SMS or text to 447537 401-829. And on the webcast. So what I'd like to start with is essentially to ask each of these wonderful people, and I'm just going to give you their name and title, to sort of state, when you wake up each morning, what is it about this issue and the opportunities that we face now that energizes you? So we'll start with Vasna Ramasar at the end, who's a research associate, Earth Systems Governance Project, and she's done a lot of work on the ground in Southern and East Africa. And so when you wake up, again, what is it about this issue that either makes you go, oh my God, or oh yes?
Yeah, that's a hard question to always answer. But I think for me, the big thing on that is I wake up in the morning thinking I actually make a difference to it. I'm an African, I'm female, developing country, a little bit younger than many of the other panelists here. And that's an opportunity to do something, whether it's at the very local scale of governance where I work or whether it's being on a panel like this. That gets me excited, the potential of what I could do with that.
Do you see youth in particular as, is their role to be a sort of a cattle prod, or to actually have the ideas and carry them forward?
Well, I think it's both. I think on one level, yes, there's the energy and enthusiasm of many of the young people that I've met that says, come on, guys, do something. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that most of the youth are doing a lot themselves. So we're not just sitting back and leaving it to the senior people to make the change happen. But there are a lot of amazing young people doing it themselves, and we have to recognize that.
That's great. So Yannick Glemarec, who is at UNDP, and you head the Division of Environmental Finance. And that's kind of the heart of the traditional approach here. When you hear young people kind of expressing frustration, what do you say to kind of articulate that there still are things that development banks and treaty processes might be able to contribute?
I would maybe start with the oh yeah, and after with the oh no. I think over the past 20 years, we have learned a lot about how to make markets better work for environment. And what kind of public policies, information policies, regulatory policies, economic policies can help catalyze private finance towards sustainable development. And for example, in the field of green commodities, such as, for example, biodiversity-friendly coffee, right now we have a market of about $60 billion a year, and this is fairly significant, and this could reach $220 billion by 2020. Same thing in terms of clean energy. 10 years ago, it was very difficult to create a lot of enthusiasm for renewable energy or energy efficiency. Today, the clean energy market is about $230 billion and could move to $450 billion by 2020.
So this is real money.
So it's real money,
right,
enough to basically transform the way the economy works. So it's not impossible that by 2020, we will have for $2 trillion of market that simply did not exist 10 years ago. So that is the oh yeah. And the oh no is that actually, despite that, we haven't yet fully changed the economic planning model. And there was a lot of talk 20 years ago about coming with national sustainable development strategies. Now we're speaking about low-emission, climate-resilient development strategies. And all this, and the outcome documents for the Rio +20 speak about green growth strategies. And all these strategies so far haven't changed so much in the way we conceive economic planning. And some countries, for example, have 10, 12, 15 of these strategies already. And one of the reasons is because it's not so much a strategy per se, but the way they are designed, the type of multi-stakeholder cooperation that takes place in designing them, that has to change. And I very much appreciated the comment of the former speakers, which is that the strategies will be as good as the collaboration process behind their formulation.
So Warren Evans, you're a senior advisor at the World Bank, and you had directed their environmental programs for a while. Now, the World Bank just came out with a report that when I read it and tweeted about it a few weeks ago, it was in the New York Times. The headline in the Times was, "Dire Poverty Falls Despite Global Slump." And it mentioned that 2 Millennium Development Goals have been achieved years in advance. And you could read that and say, well, actually, maybe we don't need Governance 2.0. I mean, are things basically going in the right direction and we're just not realizing it?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I think that that there are a number of areas of development that are going in the right direction. I get up in the morning, to go back to your question.
The environment a special case?
Yeah. The environment is unfortunately is poorly measured anyway, and so we don't know that much about where it's going. We know it's not going in the right direction. So that report did not talk about what great strides have been made on the environment front, I guarantee it. But I think that I'm one of the old guys, right? And I get up in the morning, I can either be very frustrated with the lack of progress on a number of issues, but in fact, I get up in the morning and I'm actually pretty optimistic. And I'm optimistic because of people like you. I see tremendous progress being made in a lot of areas, in spite of a lack of a willingness of a number of governments to come together on major issues like climate change and reach agreements in a timely manner that actually make the difference. That there's action happening on the ground in spite of that lack of progress, and I think that's a good sign. It's action that's being undertaken by civil society organizations. It's action being taken by youth organizations and youth on their own, local communities. There's a lot of good things happening out there that can be built upon to see real sustainable progress on major issues. What I find frustrating has been covered by the previous speakers. I find frustrating the fact that we are still based on a GDP mentality, and that we still don't measure the use of resources of our natural resource base. We don't measure the consumption of materials that we don't need to be using anyway as a part of that progress. So there's a good. I also have the good news and the bad news.
There are questions starting to come in from the webcast and Twitter, so we'll get to those in a couple of minutes. Daniëla Mariuzzo, you're at the Rabobank and in charge of corporate social responsibility in Brazil. So you're based in Brazil, which is a remarkable country that's seen incredible progress in recent years. When you look at the governance arena from that standpoint, what kinds of things excite you or exasperate you?
Well, I work with Brazilian farmers, so every day is a oh yeah day, because you're really in a very brilliant position now to make the difference. And for 12 years, I'm working specifically with environmental and labor legislation in the farms. And what we can see now is that there is a huge progress regarding the farmers' mentality. What is very nice, but still there is a lot of work to be done. And what I miss is that we need more involvement from the governments at all to set long-term frameworks to work with the natural capital. So I'm really enthusiastic to be here today to call for the other banks and other private sector institutions to realize, to really go deeper in the natural capital declaration, where we are calling for the governments to set frameworks and ways to report the dependence and the impacts that our institutions are generating using the capital network.
That's a great arena to be in. I haven't been to Brazil since the early 90s when I wrote my book about the Amazon, and I can't wait to see some of the changes that have taken place. And there's still huge challenges, but there's been a lot of progress. But that leads to one of these interesting questions, and Gustavo Fonseca is really nicely positioned to get at it, which is the social responsibility or social issues or getting social or economic progress often is at odds with environmental goals. You can have expanding agriculture, and that can create various problems of other kinds. And Gustavo is the head of Natural Resources Group at Global Environmental Fund, GEF, as it's been known for 20 years. But he was also at Conservation International before that, which is, again, out there trying to mesh human activities with ecological limits. So when you wake up in the morning, what gets you going or makes you scream?
Look, I think we've made a lot of progress since 1992. Of course, the progress that we've made so far is vastly insufficient to really address the global problems. I'm working currently at the Global Environment Facility, which serves several international conventions. You're talking about governance. And we've been actually moderately successful in moving many of these agendas to variable degrees. But by all estimates, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity failed to achieve its 2010 target to significantly reduce the rate of biodiversity loss. But scientific assessments that have been published recently have shown clearly that without that action, we would be in much worse shape than we are now. This doesn't mean that we should be waking in the morning and feeling good about what we've done, but it means that if we do more, and if we do more in a very focused way, we can actually change that. And to your question about development and environment being at odds, I think that conflict is behind us now. I think that we all came to Rio in '92 convinced that the Sustainable Development Agenda lacked its environmental pillar. We came out of Rio with 3 major streams in terms of accords. Somehow they became fragmented, and now we need to reconnect the dots because as science, and we've seen this over the past 2 days, have shown we are dealing with complex systems that cannot be addressed by teasing out biodiversity out of climate change, out of agriculture, water, and so we need to reconnect these elements so that we can make natural capital a reality as the basis for sustainable development. I hope that Rio +20 will be a launching pad for this new paradigm and making the bridges across these accords and the way that we provide financing for developing countries that need to be leapfrogged into this new model really a reality.
So this is a really good time after hearing these insights to move to Oran Young, who at University of California, Santa Barbara is a professor who focuses on the intersection of science and diplomacy. In fact, he's the co-author of a recent book, Science Diplomacy, correct? And so when you look at, my first question for you, along with this question of what gets you excited or frustrated, is what distinguishes environmental diplomacy from the successes we've had through treaty making and other arenas, that kind of thing? So again, what's your opportunity list for now? But also, that's a question that lingers in my mind. And then we'll get to the audience questions that are coming in.
Okay, thanks very much.
Sure.
Well, let me respond in terms of your original question of what makes me worry when I get up in the morning. And I want to answer that question in terms of what I call the Anthropocene governance gap. What do I mean by that? We've had a lot of experience with governance, and we've had a fair amount of success even up to the international level. We've figured out how to cooperate across international boundaries to clean up the Rhine River. We've done a pretty good job of finding ways to manage Antarctica. We've even dealt with a global problem like the depletion of stratospheric ozone. But it seems to me that the signature problems of the Anthropocene, climate change, the loss of biological diversity, have a number of characteristics which make them different and particularly difficult to address in terms of our familiar methods of dealing with governance problems. One is that these issues are characterized by extreme connectivity or extreme teleconnections. As Gustavo was just saying, teasing these problems apart, dealing with them piecemeal doesn't seem to work. Another is that these problems, they seem to be characterized by a high likelihood of nonlinear change, abrupt events, irreversibility. And a third is that these are problems where we seem to be operating near the boundaries, operating on the edge. You've heard about planetary boundaries, for example. These are problems where we don't have a lot of margin for making mistakes. We've historically engaged in trial and error. We've figured out after a while what to do to address a problem. But that doesn't seem to be a luxury that we can really afford. So there's a class of problems that have these characteristics, which I would call the signature governance problems of the Anthropocene, which somehow call for a very different mode of addressing governance problems than we have been familiar with before. So we've done a great job with things before, but now we have this new challenge.
There have been a couple of papers the last few years that have characterized climate as a super wicked problem. There's a term, it's actually a technical term in economics and other arenas where they focus on complicated situations called a wicked problem, but climate is super wicked, which I think is another way to articulate this, these signature issues you're talking about.
Well, I actually don't particularly like that terminology because saying super wicked suggests that maybe we should throw up our hands.
Okay.
Well, this is beyond human capacity to address. I don't think that's true. I think that the critical issue is one of finding a fit, or what Eleanor Ostrom would say, going beyond panaceas, finding the right kind of governance response to the particular characteristics we have. In this case, I believe, and I believe very strongly, that we are confronting the need for a kind of paradigm shift. We can't just operate on a business as usual basis. And we've experienced paradigm shifts before in other areas. For example, after the great world wars of the 20th century, we thought we need to really shift our mental discourse from national security to collective security. After the Great Depression of the 20th century, we said we have to shift our mental maps from autarky to some kind of managed internationalism. We are, I think, now in the face of sustainable development, environmental issues, where we need to have a fundamental paradigm shift. It's not a matter of just changing the status of the UN Environment Program, useful as that might be for certain purposes, but we need some kind of fundamental change in the way we deal with these things. And I would characterize that as moving from sustainable use of natural capital to some form of planetary stewardship as the new sort of paradigm. This is a fundamental problem. And here, just in closing these remarks, I want to make a little pitch. We did an exercise organized by UNEP called the Foresight exercise. And we came up with a report that has 21 issues for the 21st century. And after we've identified the 21 issues, we ranked them. And a panel of experts with a lot of input from the outside world ranked #1 issue for the 21st century. We called it aligning governance to the challenge of global sustainability.
Yeah. So that is this idea.
That was the first issue in front of global society for the 21st century.
I need someone to Google for that Foresight exercise and then post and tweet it. Okay. We do have some good questions coming in. I'll give you one that came from the webcast. This is from Patrick Cunningham at Indigenous Peoples Cultural Support Trust. The period since Rio '92 has seen many non-binding agreements on environment and social issues, but also at the same time, the establishment of the World Trade Organization. Basically, there's environmental issues, again, don't operate in a vacuum. a hugely powerful body outside the UN system, et cetera. And to restore a proper balance in the way mankind interacts with the Earth, we need to counterbalance to the WTO. Is it time to establish the World Environment Organization, which must have equal status and equal powers to the WTO? I would love to hear from those who are sort of embedded in the environmental development bureaucracy. Is there any remote chance of that kind of thing happening? Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me? I don't think my mic is working.
Oh, it's not working at all?
No.
Doesn't sound like it.
Could we get a handheld or something? Anyone else want to jump in?
Is mine working?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Warren, it's on to you.
I'm happy to answer that. No.
No.
I don't see that as I don't. You know, the recent UNEP meeting that just took place a couple of months ago, this was a major part of the discussion, and I didn't see any indication of a willingness to put up the kind of funds that would be required.
Yeah.
And certainly there are some key governments that are very much against that kind of a move.
Let me actually rephrase this slightly and focus on the WTO, whether more environmental issues will come to the WTO, like as trade issues, the European aviation emissions question, that kind of thing. Do you see any, maybe, Gabriel?
Well, yeah, just to respond to the first question, I believe that we need something. It's not necessarily a World Environment Organization, but we need some overarching structure, a framework that brings these fragmented accords, fragmented funding lines, fragmented mandates, overlapping mandates. Somehow we need to coordinate that. And whether that comes from a top-down structure or where it comes from a framework that connects all of these dispersed activities, I don't think we're going to get there. So I think there's a lot of waste in the system and not a lot of focus. But the question of trade is becoming a very controversial one, particularly in the discussions leading to Rio. The whole question of green economy is being diverted by tensions regarding whether greening the economy is actually going to penalize developing countries because they aren't there yet in terms of comparative advantages to putting their systems at that level that developed countries can transition more readily. So this is becoming quite a contentious issue, and one that I think needs to be had, and I think it's going to be a big point of discussion in Rio.
Andy, can I make a quick comment on that? I mean, I think that this question of whether you have a World Environment Organization that sits almost at the same level as the World Trade Organization is counterproductive, because you're just setting them up to be in conflict with each other. If we're trying to talk about this as global sustainability issues, then are we not saying that we have to have some sort of convergence of an organization that is addressing all of these issues at the same time? So we're talking about sustainability. We're not saying environment versus development or trade.
There's a question here that builds on Oran's remarks about new approaches and on basically the organization of this session. Kim Christiana from the US via the webcast says, humanity has experimented with changing the status quo many times in past centuries, usually with drastic consequences. How can we achieve greater equality and thus sustainability without resorting to, for example, force? In other words, is it a revolution? Is there a route to a paradigm shift in this arena that that's realistic? Can you see how, given the power of these embedded institutions and norms, is there a way forward?
Well, I think that's the great question. I mean, if you look at the previous cases, they occurred in the aftermath of extremely disruptive, costly events like world wars, the Great Depression of the 20th century. Those were catalysts to move us toward different ways of thinking. The challenge we have today is whether or not we can make a shift of the same magnitude in terms of our basic concepts, values, principles, and so on, in a less destructive manner.
Can we get ahead of the disaster?
Can we get ahead of the disaster and possibly, therefore, head off the disaster? And you've heard yesterday or the day before people like Will Steffen say that we don't have much time. Humankind has often worked out these governance issues on a sort of slow trial and error basis. We've tried various things. Maybe it's taken decades or a century. We have a decade. My best hope is that that cultures, in the broad sense of the term, can somehow, especially in this day and age of the digital age, new ways of thinking, new terminology, new concepts, new ideas can spread a whole lot more rapidly than was the case in the past, where it might have taken several generations to move toward new ways of thinking. So on the one hand, we have a tight schedule, not much time here. Yeah. On the other hand, we are in a new world in which things can go viral, things can evolve much more quickly than was the case in the past. So that's my worry, and that's my hope.
This is an issue I grapple with all the time on .earth on my blog. I did a piece that essentially said, which comes first, peak everything or peak us? In other words, can we modulate our trajectories ahead of before nature enforces the limits?
Exactly,
it's an interesting question.
Mean, if we don't, nature will enforce limits. And
the ultimate enforcer.
I mean, it may not be the end of the human race, but I mean, in terms of any ethics of compassion, it would be a very expensive transition.
Yeah,
so that's our challenge. Can we do this in a more humane way?
We'll find out. We're going to go to some Twitter remarks. I think they'll come up on the screen here. Some Twitter questions. And then we have a few more minutes. And there is going to be a press conference, by the way, at 10:15. I have a note about it here somewhere. 10:15, including an announcement on a new economic indicator beyond GDP. So for those who are interested, check outside and you'll find out more about the press conference at 10:15. And I can't quite see that screen. So, literally my eyesight is bad enough. Oh, here we go. Here's one. And they're moving too fast. Look at that. It's great. I would have to have someone read out to me one or two before we can get to that. There's some more comments that have come in. Well, actually, I'm going to start with one from my own list of remarks. You mentioned the Montreal Protocol, and quite often that's been held out as an example of its success. But there was, I think, maybe an over-expectation that could be carried over as a model for carbon. Like moving from CFCs to carbon was just, we did it once, we can do it again. And I see some nods, and maybe both of you could quickly weigh in on that.
Both of us have been working on the Montreal Protocol too. We're speaking about something totally different in the sense that with the Montreal Protocol, we are speaking about phasing out a limited number of gases in a few thousand installations. And we had actually most of the required substitutes. So it's a relatively easy problem with a relatively easy set of re-engineering solutions. When we are speaking about climate change, we are speaking about changing our production and consumption patterns. So we are speaking about changing the way 7 billion people behave. It's a problem of a totally different magnitude that calls for a much wider array of policy solutions.
I would only add that the other big difference is that the only adaptation to ozone depletion is stronger suntan lotion. So there's a completely different level of challenge to adapting to the impacts of climate change.
So we have we have a couple minutes left. So I'd like let's move to sort of the closing round.
Maybe on the Montreal Protocol, at least one thing which is relevant with the Montreal Protocol is to show that we can do it. That's coming back to the super wicked problem. Actually, when we started working on the Montreal Protocol in the 80s, we did not think that we will be able to make such a difference that fast.
And in terms of governance structure, the Montreal Protocol also showed a feature that you don't see in other conventions. It is a nimble accord. It was amended 5 times, which is you don't find this thing often in other accords. In other words, it was very flexible to adjust to new pollutants, and it was really effective also in having consequences for the climate, because ozone-depleting substances are also greenhouse gases, and the effect has been tremendous.
Just on that point, the Montreal Protocol is by far the most effective climate agreement that we have so far. In other words, the reductions of greenhouse gas emissions under the Montreal Protocol exceed those under the UNFCCC by a large margin.
So we have literally like 1 or 2 minutes left. There is a tweet that has come in from Resilient Science. It's Resilience SCI is the tag. What new types of governance can cope with and take advantage of the social and economic surprises the Anthropocene will bring? In other words, this is, well, you were kind of implying it, but learn and adjust. Can we get comfortable with a more iterative strategies going forward? The whole approach until now, certainly until Copenhagen, was to seal a deal. And in America, it was a comprehensive climate bill. It was as if we were going to solve the whole thing with one big package. That's, if anything, seems to have gone away. It's that sense. So can you think of an architecture that can move us to a new, more flexible approach? And let's just end with the voice of youth here and move forward.
I mean, I think in response to that question, I would go back to how people think about governance. And governance is meant to be more than just government. And that's the thing, I think, where we really have the opportunities is it's not just global governance, it's also what's coming from the bottom up. It is so many different movements by so many different actors. That's what's going to help us to respond in the best way possible.
What a great way to end, because that's so tweetable. Governance is more than government. That's really an important thing to keep in mind going forward. So thank you all for listening, and thank this marvelous panel. And again, this is just the beginning of a discussion that will go on for a long time to come. And we'll move on next to other activities. Thank you all.